that's our first pitfall. But I think most of the damage that a property owner suffers in terms of a resumption occurs before there's any publicity or anything in the public arena about a project or what the project is about. And why I say that is that most times when we search for developments or projects that are about to happen, there's been lots of work done behind the scenes by government without necessarily promoting or providing details of the corridors or corridor that they propose and the reason for the proposal or the project. By that I mean that it's uncanny how often people get a notice or get some notification that you might be in a corridor, but that seems to me to be long after there's been decisions made within the powers of government or their government bodies that they're going to be looking at proceeding and taking your land. So that's a process that I think we need to be lobbying our members about, saying that there needs to be more transparency about potential projects and corridors that they might be looking at so that landowners can be properly heard and landowners can have a say in what's the impact and why it's not necessarily the right area. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Acquisition of Land Act is very wide in terms of the powers for taking land. And if you just bear with me a sec, when you look at the Acquisition of Land Act, they've got a schedule to the Act, which it's Schedule 1, which says the purpose for taking land, and we've got purposes relating to transportation, and then underneath that it has aviation, beacons, bridges, docks, couldn't be any wider. Then purposes relating to the environment, purposes relating to educational and cultural facilities, purposes relating to health services, natural resources, recreation, law enforcement, urban planning, sanitation, and then construction, works, construction and facilities, purposes relating to non-profit or not-for-profit organisations. That's a really interesting scenario that they could take property or acquire a property for a non or not-for-profit organisation. And then the catch-all is other purposes. Any purpose declared under a regulation to be a purpose for which land may be taken under the Act. So suffice it to say that when clients come to see me about a resumption, I say to them that it will be difficult to stop the resumption, if not impossible, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't object, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a go at trying to stop it, because what we find is that unless we do objections, they just carry on regardless, and the objection is not about compensation, it's about the taking of the land. You can't lodge an objection that deals with any aspect of compensation, because all they'll say to you is, well, that's bad luck. That's a process, if the resumption proceeds, that you'll have to discuss compensation at that point in time. So it's important to focus, if you're in an objection process, to focus on the reasons why a resumption of part or all of someone's property should not occur. And you'll see that a lot of the resumption objections are, you don't need a corridor as big as you're proposing, or you don't need to take as much of the land as you're proposing, or you don't need to take any of the land. That's a difficult process to succeed in, because you need to remember that the mindset at this stage is a person who's the owner of the property receives a formal notice of intention to resume. That notice of intention to resume normally gives them about 5 weeks to lodge an objection. About a week to 10 days later, you are entitled to appear before the authority that's proposing to resume your property, and then that authority provides a report on the objection hearing to you. Within about 2 weeks of that, you respond and say, well, yes, that's what was discussed at the meeting, or no, you haven't got everything. They then take about 8 weeks to prepare a final report on the objection. What then happens? Having prepared their final report on the objection, which usually is no reason not to proceed with the resumption, because you need to remember, by the time they've issued a notice of intention to resume, it will almost invariably be a fait accompli that they're going to proceed with the resumption. The objection process is really a bit farcical. I say that for this reason, that they allegedly have a person who's appointed as the delegate who is said to have had nothing to do with the project, but he or she happens to be employed by the authority. So it's very difficult to even contemplate that they have any objectivity, and they're usually flanked by a couple of their the people who are responsible for the project. So you go and put your submissions, and then they will consider it. But I can tell you that I think there's been only one, maybe two in the whole time I've been doing it for about 35, 40 years, where an objection has had any major impact upon the proposed resumption. I should, however, tell you that I have one at present where the objection's been going for in excess of 2 years. That's most unusual. But what's happened with it is, as we have just said, you get to a stage where you get the objection hearing report, then they say it's going to proceed. We'll now apply to the governor or to the minister to get approval, and ask the minister to get the governor and council to gazette in the Queensland Government Gazette the taking of your land. What I've done with this particular one, and it's in the Sunshine Coast, is we've objected firstly to the Sunshine Coast Council. They took no regard of our objection. My clients went to a lot of trouble and time and expense, and we engaged engineers, because the argument was there was another corridor that already exists, which is near our client's property, but for reasons best known to council, they decided for some reason that was no longer suitable. So when they told us that they were heading off to the minister, we then got in touch with the minister, and we have, for the last, I think it's 2 years, been corresponding from time to time with the minister, because the minister calls for more evidence and more material from the local authority. Local authority provides a response which is usually just self-serving or half-baked. The local authority then, we get a copy of their response, we respond to that, and the last time we've had anything to do on that so far is about 6 weeks ago, but it had been dormant for about 4 months before that. But for those people so far, the objection has had merit, and for us and for them, if the resumption doesn't proceed, it will mean a lot to them, because the proposed resumption in that case is such that the corridor, it's for road, will divide their property in two. And that's the last thing they want to do because they've been cane farmers and they use it's agricultural land, and it just will make it so much more difficult for them to operate their property. So that's a work in progress. But having said that, most of the others that I can remember in recent times where we've objected or even gone to the minister, that's been a waste of time. A more recent one, as most of you would know, the Sippy Downs area on the Sunshine Coast, that used to be cane farming land and farming land. It's now become a residential area, plus some schools are being built there. We did objections for some of the landowners, and the main recent ones have been where schools were proposed to be built. So we went to the minister, but we didn't get any traction out of that. They just proceeded regardless of what our objections were. So the objection process, even though it's very difficult to achieve a result, you still need to lodge objections because that process often does give you further information about the project, or you glean further information from having those meetings with the project officers. So whilst you can tell your client, look, this probably won't achieve much, we'll learn a lot more about the project and the timing and what they're proposing, such as have they done noise studies, is it a design and construct, or is the state going to design it? Some of the recent ones have been the state contracts out so that the contractor designs and constructs. So all the state does is resume the area of land and then hands it over to the successful tenderer. And then that's for the first time that our clients really are able to get any real reason or evidence as to precisely what is going to be constructed in that corridor. The other thing that seems to be fairly recent, and when I say that in the last 18 months, is that where corridors are identified, and I should say one comes to mind is the upgrade of the roadways from Brisbane to the Gold Coast. There's about a 48-kilometre stretch that they've now flagged as being an area that they're proposing in time to resume some of the properties. So you can actually go and see where the corridor is, and it's gazetted. So for people who are owners of those properties, they mightn't get a gazettal notice for the actual taking of the land for 3, 4, 5, who knows. Change of government might never happen, but they've got a blight on their property because anyone who searches will now see that here it is, it's gazetted as an area of interest, and here's the proposed corridor. That's grossly unfair and grossly unfair to the owner, particularly if they ever want to sell, because you will know from first-hand experience that no one wants to necessarily buy a property that's about to be partially resumed or have a substantial issue with a resumption. The same thing has happened up here in the Sunshine Coast with respect to the rail corridor. I had a client in the last 6 months that his property was gazetted in the same way. Part of his property was gazetted in the same way as being, this is where the corridor is going to run. This is where we've gazetted the corridor to run. And guess what? He then tries to sell it. No one wants to buy it. We make some further inquiries and then find out, oh no, we've changed our mind about that particular area. It's no longer required. But did they do anything about it? No, not until we went to them and said, now look, we understand it's no longer required. They say yes. And then only last week, after about 2-3 months probably, did we get a copy of the gazettal notice. But they were doing nothing until we made the inquiry. I think that's disgraceful conduct in this sense that has no respect of the to your ownership or to the property owner's ownership, not only have they put a blight on the property by the gazettal notice of saying this is a proposed rail corridor, they then didn't have the decency to say, oh, sorry, we've now changed our mind, the corridor's been amended and we just haven't upgraded it. But for my clients' due diligence in checking out the corridor again and checking whether it was in fact required, that wouldn't have happened, and his property would be still down as an area of interest. The next thing that I wanted to talk to you about is the gazettal. And as most of you will know, that once it's gazetted, we no longer own the land, and all our right at that point, in terms of our ownership, turns to the question of compensation. So you own it today, it's gazetted at midnight tonight, and from midnight onwards, you don't own that portion of property. I can tell you firsthand that lots of people who I've acted for, particularly mums and dads who have had their home resumed for a corridor, they're aghast at the idea of, or the thought of, A, they've still got a mortgage, B, they've been paid nothing, and suddenly overnight they no longer own the property. Now, you then have to tell them that in terms of getting any payment, they have to lodge a claim with the government for whatever they suggest is a reasonable amount of compensation. Then under the Acquisition of Land Act, the resuming authority or the government has 90 days in which to pay an advance payment. That is the amount that they suggest at that point is the amount of their valuation of the property. It doesn't cover any other disturbance items, doesn't cover any other items that might be claimable. It's simply that the valuation that some valuer has assessed as being the value of the property. It's always a conservative value because it's so soon after the resumption. But that's the only way that anyone in the first instance is able to get any money. Having got the advance payment, you have to sign off saying it's an advance payment, and then your rights to claim compensation continue. You're not bound to the figure that they've offered you. It's simply signed off as an advance. For lots of people, that's something, but if they've got a mortgage, you'll usually find that because your mortgagee has first rights, that they obviously take whatever is owing, or if there's more owing than what's been paid, then they'll take the lot. So it's a very worrying and troublesome time for people at that point of time. The next thing that I think we should talk about is the word compensation. I think that that's a word that is so freely used by resuming authorities that it gives a false sense of hope to a lot of people, because you'll know that when a resuming authority's representative comes out and talks about, well, we're going to take this much of your land or whatever, they talk about the word compensation, and they say, look, you'll get compensated for that, and you'll get compensated for us coming to take your land. Well, that's true, but it's when you drill down to what does that word mean and what does it in fact mean, I get, that the landowner for the first time finds out precisely what they assess and what it means. I've had many first-hand experiences for clients where you find that compensation that the client understood or thought was the case is far from it. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples that might illustrate it well for you, and also it's difficult to understand why there are different regimes even within the government as to how compensation's treated. The first one that I wanted to talk about is the Traveston Dam. I suspect a lot of you had heard about the proposal for a Traveston Dam out between Karoi and Gympie. The government set up a corporation to acquire land in that area for the purpose of the dam. Now, if you ask me about that process, from a landowner's point of view, it was by far, and I mean streets ahead of any other resumption I've ever done, because I'm sure the government's message internally was get up there, buy those properties, pay them a handsome sum and get least resistance. Not only did they do that, they strategically targeted a few properties, offered them money that they couldn't resist really. And then what did they do? They still had people saying, we're not selling, we're not doing anything. They put in tenants, and they'll deny this till the cows come home, but they put in tenants who were, let's put it this way, less desirable for any area, let alone that area. So people could see that their society in which they lived, their community, was being eroded away significantly. So most people got on the bandwagon and decided to have a go at selling. And it wasn't a resumption process, but that was the threat that was hanging over their head. I can tell you that some days when we negotiated, we got money that was unbelievable. It was, without doubt, a project that I'm sure the government had made up their mind, we're going to put this dam in and we're going to make sure we acquire whatever property at whatever price. Some properties, one property, I think 29 million, another 16 million, lots of millions, lots of 2 millions. But then the other sweetener was, if you're in stage one, which was the first part of the proposed dam project, you could rent your property back. So you get a really good compensation, rent your property back, and your rent for that property was $20 a week. So someone had just been paid 16 million, pays $20 a week for their dairy farm. That's one. Then after stage one, which was about, say, 2 years from when they commenced the negotiations, it was going to be extinguished, they thought, 2 to 3 years. There was then a stage two. So what happened with stage two? Those people, some were in one and two, but stage two, they were offered leases to go to 2035. So they were 10 by 10 by 10, etc. leases, but their rent started off at 25% of market rent. So some were paying $50 a week, some were paying $62.50, and they all signed up. So what did they do? A lot of them signed up and then went and bought another property, but stayed in their own property. So for a lot of people in that process, it was an unbelievable process. But true to government's form, if any of you have done the drive from Karoi to Gympie now on the new highway, what's happened there is that the people who are on the eastern side of the highway, and Traveston Dam happened to be on the western side, and that was the boundary. Those on the eastern side that had their properties resumed were resumed by main roads. So they were not getting compensation, not near as much as was being offered in the Traveston Dam area. And they were also paying what was determined to be market rent. So that was, say, $300 or $400 a week, rent a home, and across the road, someone's paying $20. So I wrote to Anna Bligh at that stage because Peter Beattie started it, wrote to Anna Bligh and said, look, what's going on here? You're the same government, might be different projects, but how can you justify that? The person lives in this area, pays $300 or $400 a week, and over the road they're paying $20 or $50 if they're in stage 2. Unsurprisingly, we didn't get any traction on that argument, and we didn't get any response. But that just shows how the government had targeted Traveston Dam as a project that they wanted least resistance. Having done Traveston Dam and a number of landowners in that area, I then dealt with what's then known as the water pipeline from Brisbane to Lake Macdonald at Croy. Well, if I was buoyed by what happened in Traveston, I was brought back to earth with a huge thud because they would fight you over every dollar. It was the most difficult process. And again, people who have been subjected to the water pipeline would say to a person that it is the worst process they've ever been involved in. Why is that? That it's really because the advanced party, as I call them, the property liaison persons come along and say, look, we'll offer you compensation. We'll make sure that when we've been through and placed the pipeline underground, this property will be better than we found it. We will make sure it's put back better than we found it. Well, as we know, that wasn't true. And they had an uncanny knack of having property liaison officers hang around for about 3 months. Then after 3 months is a new one. And then after the next 3 months is a new one. So they'd all be able to say, well, you shouldn't have been told that. So that was just a terrible process for people to go through. But it got even worse because you would see how much they spent or wasted on contracts. Then the poor old landowner comes along to get paid. They say, oh, it's only a pipeline, it's underground, out of sight, out of mind. So we're going to offer you about 35% of the rate per hectare, saying that's all the blight is on your property. And we'd be saying, well, hold on, it's not only that, can't build or plant trees within 5 metres either side of the pipeline. The way you've left it, you can clearly see on this property where you've been because you've taken topsoil. And one of the arguments by a lot of people was that the topsoil got taken and got sold. The government would say, well, that's not us. If that happened, that shouldn't have happened, but it will be a matter that you'll have to get that or deal with the contractors. But we'd be saying, well, hold on, regardless of who's at fault, you've taken our soil and it's nowhere near as good. So then we'd have settlement conferences for the compensation. They'd turn up with anywhere between 5 and 7 people, 5 and 8 people. I don't know what the 5 to 8 were doing. There was 2 or 3 of them who did something, but the rest did nothing. But yet they'd fight us for every last dollar. It was by far and away the worst project and the most difficult. And it took until, I think 2 months ago, I settled the last one, and I did about 95 of them. It was just one where you could go and say the Coordinator General has a policy that they trot out, look, we can't give you that because we've got to account for public money. And that's the old catch cry that it's government money or taxpayers' money, so we've got to look after it. But when you see what they do with the projects and when you see with their contracts, you see just how farcical that statement is and how insulting it is to the landowner who's borne the brunt of the resumption, but they don't care what they effectively have wasted on the way through. But the landowner's got to almost beg, borrow and steal. The next thing is in the method of valuing and compensation. One of the things that I always find difficult in compensation claims is that I often say to the resuming authority representatives, the property services section, that look, your valuer or your expert can't be right every day. We must have a day where what our experts are saying is correct. But as we know, if you've had first-hand experience with them, unless they're experts prepared to agree or move, they say, well, we've got to write reports to get this through. So therefore, unless they're prepared to move, we can't come to your figure. Now, this is supposed to be a process of negotiation, but it's a one-way negotiation. There are times the value will move, but if, as in the water pipeline, they had a fixed regime, we were we found it very difficult to get them to move, but also if they did move, the move was an appalling small amount. So for a lot of those people, they're then faced with, well, what's the value of your compensation? Say it's 200, 300, 400,000. And let's say they've offered us 300 out of 400,000. Well, they'll know that I'll be telling my clients that you wouldn't risk going to the land court for a difference of $100,000 because A, the costs will be too much, or B, your exposure to costs are a real concern. And why I say that is Section 27 of the Acquisition of Land Act provides that if you go to the land court and your final claim is, say, $1 million, and the resuming authority has offered you $500 as their final offer, so the difference is $500,000. The Section 27 of the Act says that we have to get better than the mean difference, so better than $750,000 to get an order for costs. If we get $750 or less, then we're at risk of having an order for costs against us. So the property owner could have not only their land resumed, run the risk of going to the land court, pay all the monies that are required to get to the land court, fail, and then find not only have they had to pay their own costs, but pay the costs of the resuming authority. So you have to be really careful, and you have to make sure that your experts are ones who are prepared to stand up and be counted for what they've assessed their valuation or their advice on. That's a really, that probably for me is the most troublesome part of the legislation, that not only have you had your land impacted, taken or impacted if it's easements, you then run the risk that if you take the fight on, that you could suffer not only loss of all your compensation by paying costs, but you suffer the consequences of having a fight for what is deemed to be your rights. And people don't go to tribunals without having advice from an expert who says, well, my opinion is it's worth X. And if they lose, or that's found to be not a good basis, then they could pay a heavy price for that. The other downfall with the Act is I think it's too cumbersome for landowners to get to the land court. I really think that when you have a look at the Act, it's been in force since 1967. It's had a few amendments, but no major overhaul. But one of the things that I think should be the case is that there should be a provision where parties, meaning the resuming authority and the landowner, should be able to go to, and I don't want to call it a tribunal, but there should be a method of some sort of case appraisal where, say, a tribunal of 2 or 3 people hear each side's argument without it being necessarily as formalised as a court process, and that you don't have to go and spend thousands and thousands of getting reports. Say, look, this is what the claim's about, this is what our valuer says, and get a determination from them. But I'm equally saying that if that was a process, an intervening process, that if you are unhappy with that ruling, you can still go to the land court. But if you go to the land court and get less than the ruling, then I wouldn't be adverse to cost consequences coming in then. But at present, if you don't agree on compensation, you have mediation when you go through the land court, or but you've spent a lot of money getting to that point. You've usually got every report that you need, and if mediation fails, it's off to a hearing. So it's an expensive process, so that I think that the government needs to be lobbied to look at a more inexpensive way where landowners are entitled to test their valuation in a least expensive or less expensive way. The other thing that I think you also should be conscious of, some resuming authorities will pay your reasonable costs of negotiating, including experts' fees and valuers' fees and engineering and town planning fees. I do a lot with main roads, and they're, to be fair to them in terms of that process, fairly good. But again, the worst resumption process, the water pipeline. What did they do? They said, the Act says that we only have to pay you legal and valuation and experts' fees up to the time you lodge your claim. So if you lodge your claim and you've spent 10 grand, that's what we'll pay you. But if it's taken another 12 months, 2 years and negotiating and whatever, they said, we're not paying your costs. You say, well, how do we get here? How does our client, surely you're not saying our client should bear those costs. And they said, yeah. So how did they deal with that? We'd give them a schedule saying, here's our total claim. They'd just then say, under all heads, we'll offer you this. And when we drilled down on a couple of them, they'd offered, say, 10 grand for legal fees to lodge the claim up to that point. But by this stage, legal fees might have been 30 or 40 or 50 grand. They said, well, we're not paying that. So that again, I think is immoral, but I also think that it's grossly unfair for people to be subjected to that sort of process, particularly when that leaves the landowner with a feeling that they're just being used, and the resuming authority is not caring one bit about what it does to the landowner, has no regard, no respect for the landowner's rights, and no regard, no respect for the fact that we've come here and we've taken their land. So that's a really dreadful experience that, and I can tell you the Coordinator General is streets out in front as being the worst I've ever dealt with. They were just unbelievably stingy, nasty, and trotted out the usual government money we're dealing with. So that was something that I think we need to be conscious of. The other downfall, I think, with the whole process is we're supposed to be getting what's called market value for our land. And it's market value based on valuers doing an assessment of what are the sales in the area. If there's none in the area, what's another sale that might be able to, we might be able to draw some comparison from. In theory, that's fine, but I can tell you for the airport here at Sunshine Coast, I had some cane farmers that were resumed. We went to the land court, and we produced evidence, although land court usually doesn't take any notice of it, that my clients were getting options to purchase from developers for say $250 a hectare. But if you look at market value, and you got to remember market value is on the basis that it's a cash buyer, a willing purchaser, no conditions. So the valuer's got a value on the basis that it's a cash buyer and no conditions, no timeline. It's just a cash deal. So in that case, my clients were getting $250 a hectare. When you applied the land court method of valuation of market value, my value, I think, came in at $125 a hectare, and council's valuer came in at $72 a hectare. And needless to say, my clients were horrified by both. We went to the land court, and I think we got $105 a hectare. So for them, and the press got hold of it, and they wrote up that they got so many million or whatever. But in reality, I think they got about a third of what they would have had they been able to control their own future and their own selling time. They got about a third of what I think they would have got had they been able to continue the process that they were embarking on with developers tying it up, say, for 6 months, but giving them non-refundable deposits. So for them, I'm sure they'll have gone away and said that was a terrible experience. So there are lots of shortcomings in the Act, but I don't think we should throw it all out. I think the areas for us that we need to be conscious of, I don't think there's enough transparency about proposals for the taking of land or for a project. I don't think that comes out early enough, and I don't think there's enough public consultation on that process. Secondly, I think the process of going through to the land court is too expensive, and there needs to be a tribunal or a body that's able to make some rulings or some decision on what is fair compensation without you spending a bucket of money doing it. And then the third thing is there needs to be some uniformity of approach from government to say, well, look, this is what the government does. Don't forget, they're supposed to be model citizens and model litigants. They're not supposed to take advantage of us. But I can tell you in the Coordinator General's case, they were far from model anything. It was what they wanted, and they just held out for it. And yet trotted in 7 or 8 people at every meeting and said, we're here, we've got to be careful of government money. Well, it was a great illustration of just complete waste. So what I thought I'd do now is if you had any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. And I'm happy to deal with anything to do with the Act or compensation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. I will ask somebody if there's any questions.
I think I'll be able to hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
That's good. You're not as clear as I can hear you, but it's not as clear.
I'll try to speak right into the microphone. How's that?
That'd be good.
Okay, the first question here, is the microphone on?
Yeah, thank you. Peter, we're in West of Bowen and North Queensland, and South Queensland. Do you hear that?
Yeah, in Bowen, did you say?
Yeah, Bowen, yeah, West of Bowen, yeah.
Yep, I went through there last weekend.
Beg your pardon?
I went through there last weekend.
Well, there you go. We just heard the render a bit, might be like a thin skin, I don't know, but I sort of settled down a bit with you disturbing a lot again, bring it all back, but we were dealing with up to 11 sort of resource companies, you know, from coal exploration, mineral exploration, railway lines, didn't know what we had. And starting off there, I think one of the two biggest ones is the landowners time and the legal fees.
I just missed that bit.
Big one.
I just missed the two biggest ones.
Landholders time, we don't pay for our time. And my argument that is we never initiated this, so I never asked. I just got dragged in on the front family side. And I seem to think I work for others. And then the other one is legal fees, and the word in there is reasonable. I believe reasonable should be abolished. Because you can ask $3. You're right?
No, I just missed that.
I believe reasonable should be abolished out there. If you can ask three people their opinion on reasonable, and you get three different answers.
I agree. That's in section 20, subsection 5, about what constitutes cost attributable to disturbance. And you're quite right. It says legal costs and valuation and other professional fees reasonably incurred by the claimant. Now, I agree that if they've taken your land and you're part of a resumption process or you're part of a negotiation for it, why should you be out of pocket for any of those expenses? Because at the end of the day, you didn't cause it and they want it. So why should you have to pay anything?
Absolutely correct. And then if it's getting up the legal fees getting a bit high, they get the right to walk, and I just got to pay. They can walk away.
Yes, and you see what that was a dreadful thing that happened in the Coordinator General. It's really, they would offer about 10 grand to put the claim together, but we're down the track 2 years later, having had 3 or 4 meetings with them, they're saying, oh no, we're only paying costs of lodging the claim. And you think, that's just such an immoral way, whereas a lot of other resuming authorities in negotiations, they've been prepared to pay those fees. Now, I agree with you. You could get 10 people in the room and argue what's reasonable. It should be gone. It should be you need to pay whatever the costs are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just move on to the compulsory acquisition. We were the railway line going from through, and you know, I've got something against compulsory acquisition. We're going to progress. Somebody's going to be big. I think they should be looked after. But to make a comparison, we have just recently sold a block of ground to a resource company. Now, we sat down and done our figures, and it took about 12 months with us and the resource company, but we got the 3% of where we want to be. So we found the line of gold.
You're dropping out a bit.
We told, we done our sums on the block, we didn't want to sell it, they want to buy it. And we got the 3% of where we wanted to be. But with this, that was just a straight commercial sale.
Yeah.
The compulsory acquisition, we missed our mark by 40%, and that's the comparison. And that's
I can relate to that. because my best example is those poor old cane farmers. There's absolutely no doubt in the marketplace they would have got much more than this alleged market value assessment, no doubt at all. And the market value assessment doesn't take into account the commercial realities that you often negotiate, and in the sense that you give them time to go and check out or see whether they can get it rezoned or reclassified through council. And because you give them that time, you get a higher rate as well. So, but none of that happens in this acquisition of land act process.
Yeah. We done a lot of figures on compulsory acquisition. I don't know if John got it. On this expert data and all that stuff, that's what I'm just got a lot of head to do. The last year check we had with the Governor General, their expert data had $2.5 grand fees, and it was free, but you know, you just got to wear that.
Well, that's what's wrong with the process. That's what's wrong with the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you see, governments. There's a in South Australia. There's an assessment of compensation. It's an extra called Salatium. It's not in Queensland, but it's about, you get an extra 10 or 20% for the general running around and stuffing around, but that wouldn't help in the cost regime, because we all know that it costs a bucket to put some of the claims together, because their resistance to the claim makes it even more expensive, because you have to go to that level to establish the bona fides, but they then fight you tooth and nail for every cent that you've A, spent, but B, what you say your compensation is. So, and don't forget, the law is that we're supposed to, as a landowner, get the benefit of the doubt. So any doubt should be resolved in the landowner's favour. That's what the law is. But the resuming authority don't seem to play that game too well.
Just a last comment. I don't know what the solution is, but I think your idea of 5 million to perfect people, I think probably a real good start. Thank you.
Yeah, because it doesn't. What really annoys me about the whole process is that we need to make things simplified. If you're not happy with, at the end of that day, you can have your day in the land court, but don't make it 100,000 or 200,000 or 500,000 to get there. Let's do a process where it might cost you 20 or 30 grand, not 100 or 150.
Yeah, exactly. All right, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. I think I've got one other person in the room who'd like to comment here.
Not hearing that too good?
No, okay. One more question perhaps.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
We've got a room full here of about 40 people, and they've listened to your entire address in total silence. So I'll hand over the other questioner.
I'm not sure that means they weren't listening, you see. No.
Peter, Bill Blackley, I'm speaking.
How are you?
So that basin rail, we're building a railway line from my Nambour glass to the Glencore coal mine. The coal mine eventually died a natural death. We spent 7 years negotiating with that basin rail over the corridor. We eventually got them to understand it was fair impost and splitting a property. Then the Coordinator General's department put in an infrastructure corridor, and basically lost their negotiating rights straight away, because the infrastructure corridor gave them the right to go where they like, when they like. Apparently we had 3 years to come to negotiate an agreement on compensation course, a court would award compensation.
Absolutely. Just.
So they all packed up and cleared out, and Stratbase Rail offered us $3,000 as compensation for our time. Over the 7 years, we determined that the rate of half the solicitors charged, our personal fees were $123,000.
Yeah.
They offered us $3,000 if we signed an agreement to indemnify them for any further costs. I wouldn't sign that. I told them to stick it. The Coordinator General's Department under Mr. Senior at the time paid us $10,000 some guilt money for our inconvenience, we were told.
Yeah.
Now, that was good money because he took that as a minor compensation, but we still have the infrastructure corridor sitting over our place. While the railway line probably would only be 2 chain wide, the corridor is 3 kilometres wide, one end of the property, and a kilometre wide the other end. It still sits over the property. We tried to get Mr. Beattie and Mr. Senior at the time to remove the infrastructure corridors in the railway was going to go ahead, but his reply was that was too difficult. How do we stand getting compensation for the loss of value of our land from this infrastructure corridor?
Well, the first problem we've got for anyone in this process is there has to be an actual resumption of part of your property. If it's a bit like if you see in cities, for argument's sake, a corridor happens and right next to it is another house, they're not impacted in the sense of there's no resumption, but they'll be impacted by the corridor, but they get nothing. So you've got to have an argument to say, well, you've resumed or you've taken some land. If you go away from this act, the only other areas that you then have to take civil action about nuisance and diminution in your value, but you need to be careful that you don't get led back to then the Acquisition Land Act saying, well, you don't get any compensation because you haven't been resumed. That's the one thing that's really difficult. And I've had lots of people who've come to me and said, look, this new proposal or this what's happened to us is we can't sleep. Got so much noise. So you write to the ministry, you write to the government, and you do what you can, but you have to tell them that if it's not been resumed, I can't go and claim formally compensation for you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Peter. If you've got just a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
Someone here to just offer a vote of thanks for coming and joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Christian McKay will do the vote of thanks for you. Pete, what you've outlined simply describes something that I've had personal experience with, a 6-year battle with the government department, 6 court cases, of which I ended up winning one more than my baby. But anyway, what you've outlined is the total bastardry of government, which is now endemic within the departments.
Absolutely.
Is to make it as difficult as possible to oppose them, to make it as expensive as possible to oppose them. The whole game plan is no one opposes them because you can't win it. So you laid it out very, very well. The other thing I wanted to say is you appeared for a mate of mine in Rockhampton in the last couple of days.
Oh, I did too. He's a very good person.
So we in fact are going to be careful to cast over a horse.
Yeah, I know a lot about that now.
Thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been a pleasure. And thanks for you show your acclamation.
That's been my privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you. And we need to keep, even though it's weighed against us, we need to keep fighting. Because if we don't fight, we'll go nowhere.
Fortunately, there are some of us who still are picking up the fight on a lot of different fronts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The government's, I think the government is a master at window dressing or putting another spin on something that's just suits their purpose when you know that their ulterior motive is something else. So that's why we need to keep fighting.
They're honing their skills every single day and every single year.
That sounds good. We need to keep honing them. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
That's okay. Thanks very much. Bye.